Welcome to Cognitive Liberty. I'm your host, Clyde Lewis. This show is brought to you by TLBTV and the Liberty Beacon Project. Hi, I'm Clyde Lewis, and welcome to the Liberty Beacon television show. It's on the Liberty Beacon TV network, and today I have with me the author of The Technological Elixir, Ryan Gable, who is a favorite of my other show, Ground Zero. We love having on the program such a wonderful mind and a good friend, which is, it's always nice to have good friends that are smarter than you are, actually. So welcome, Ryan, to Cognitive Liberty.
And thanks for having me, Clyde. It's a pleasure.
I was contemplating what I wanted to discuss with you today, but I think that it's obvious that there are a number of things going on that's your bailiwick, your forte, and that is something called occult engineering, which is observable right now. I was just reading an article today. Sally Quinn, who is a Washington, D.C. socialite, at least that's what they say, because she was once married to the editor of the Washington Post, I believe. And she was saying that she has a new book out about her spirituality, talking about the fact that she has thrown at least 3 hexes on people, and those 3 have died. And she says that maybe she feels a bit responsible for throwing curses at these 3 people. And I don't remember the names of those that have passed away. But I find it odd that someone is that open about the fact that in Washington, D.C., or anywhere, we have people in places of power that are actually participating in something that I've called in the past causal engineering. But this is occult causal engineering, meaning that, not through hard work or through other means, but they use magic. They didn't necessarily say witchcraft. So this is something that, is what I want to pose to you. Is, I bet, back in the times of Barack Obama, we knew that the Obamas, I think the mother of Michelle, used to practice voodoo at the White House, and it was something that the Obamas weren't too happy about. But can you give me at least an idea of how rampant or whether or not this is some sort of epidemic where we're seeing people in places of power utilizing occult engineering to somehow, I'm sure they think it makes them more powerful.
That's the first thought that actually comes to my mind, is that people that are in a position of power, beyond anything that we can possibly imagine, they're not worried about putting food on the table. They're not worried about the trivial pursuits that we go through in our daily lives. And power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely, and people will do anything and everything they can to maintain that power. Now, I didn't actually know that about Michelle's mother, but it does make sense because during Clinton's administration, when Bill wrote one of his books, he admitted in the book that Bill and Hillary went to Haiti and they were trained by a voodoo practitioner, and they studied voodoo, which might actually be called hoodoo with an H rather than voodoo. And they actually practiced voodoo. Even if you go back to Ronald Reagan, they used to hold seances in the White House, even back to Abraham Lincoln. In fact, there's a myth, perhaps a myth, maybe it's a legitimate story, that one of Lincoln's friends, one of the family friends, had actually warned him not to go to the theater because he would have been assassinated the evening that he was assassinated in the theater.
Well, wasn't Mary Todd Lincoln, Mary Todd Lincoln, from what I read in history, was actually a practicing witch. Is that true?
From what I heard, yes. I've never heard the word witch, but again, regardless if we call them a witch, a warlock, it doesn't really matter what label. I think they're still dabbling, per se, in the same types of studies. And I think one key to always address when we talk about magic, because magic, the word, has been associated with games and movies and entertainment, and it's almost as if it's lost its meaning. Magic is real in the sense of symbolism, of actions and intentions that act upon the will and that act upon the imagination. And in fact, I pulled a very small quotation from a book called Transcendental Magic by Eliphas Levi. He wrote this book in the mid-1800s. And there's 2 sentences I pulled out of the book I thought were very profound to give us an idea of how rampant, as you asked that question, how rampant this is. It goes beyond the Harry Potter style magic. It's not really anything like that. So in terms of black magic, Eliphas Levi says that the person who practices black magic, such as this woman in Washington and a handful of other quote unquote witches who have said they've cursed Trump over the past couple of months, Eliphas Levi writes this: the magician, he poisons himself in order that he may poison others. He damns himself so that he may torture others. And the more difficult or horrible the operation, the greater is its power because it acts more strongly on the imagination. Stating that magic is basically a form of intention and it focuses on the imagination. And one of the best ways to do that, something that you and I have talked about many times in the past, is through symbolism, which we find throughout the entertainment industry. We find it throughout, even in politics, when, remember the Republican Party, Bush's reversed the stars. They reversed them and turned them upside down. Symbolism is so powerful. It acts on the imagination. And when we are aware of this, shows like yours, Clyde, shows like mine, The Secret Teachings, it can break that trance. I believe so.
Well, especially during the time of 9/11, I think we see a lot of what I call sigilism, and they do something called communal magic, where it's no longer about the 3,000 that died. It's now a matter of what kind of artifacts do we have? Like, do we have a rail from the World Trade Center? I remember there was a big hullabaloo about how once the buildings collapsed, there was a cross that was seen, two beams crossing together. And the Americans said, look, it's a sign from God that there's a cross there. And I thought, well, yeah, it's a cross, of course. It's a cross with two beams. Giving it meaning, though, is what takes it on a different level. But it also seemed a little bit, I think, religious-centric in a sense that not only did we have Christians that died there, we had Jews and Muslims that were dying there. And so to actually take, I mean, and it's been done. I mean, Christians don't realize they do this. They take symbolism, like their crosses and Bibles and everything, and they use them in a more of a magical way, a haunting way, as if they are talisman or if they are sigils. And so another example of a sigil that I thought was kind of a creepy sigil was when, after 9/11, they took the flag that flew over the World Trade Center. They brought it out during a football game or a baseball game. And I thought to myself, I don't know if anybody realizes just how much of a sigil that flag has become, because all of the death and destruction and all the things that surrounded that flag have been imprinted on that flag. And that to use it in such a way that, I know they were thinking they were doing it in honorarium of those who died, but what they literally were doing was creating this ritual that would once again put in our minds over and over again the loss of life, the tragedy, and in some cases the hate. And I thought to myself, are they doing this intentionally? I know the Americans won't pick up on this. American people won't pick up on this because they're so caught up in the tragedy. But what they're seeing, and I remember there was another thing that happened. There was a traveling girder from the World Trade Center, and they bring it to schools. And what they do is they had it on a pillow, and they put it on a desk, and kids would come up and touch it, and then they would bow their heads and close their eyes as if they were worshiping it. And this is like idolatry to its highest, and it's magic at its lowest. And I don't think people realize that they're participating, regardless of what you may think of 9/11 and how patriotic you may be regarding that situation. I think that Americans need to know that they are participating in basically a necromantic ritual when they sit there and they take these items and they worship them, or they use them as idols to represent something that it really isn't. They're just inanimate objects. They haven't been sanctified or blessed or anything. They're just inanimate, and they're using them as idolatrous artifacts. And that's the thing that really I think people should be aware of.
Yeah, and it plays on, it's very much like modern marketing, and not even modern marketing, but going back to the 20s with Edward Bernays. In order to get people to buy something, instead of appealing to their reason, do you actually need this? You appeal to their emotions, and people become open to suggestibility through various forms of subliminal messaging and insinuations, how you're going to be able to live if you have this item, if you buy this product, if it's perfume or it's a car. I think it's the same type of psychological manipulation when we look at your example with the girder, or with a piece of the structure from Ground Zero, We found actually here in Boise, Idaho, I was going around when I first came over here from Florida when I moved, and I found that they actually, they claim that it's a piece of steel from the World Trade Center, but they have this big piece of metal, and it's a 9/11 memorial where you're supposed to go, just like most of them, and pray. So it's almost become like a religious shrine, as you're alluding to. And it goes much deeper subconsciously, even if people just see it as a reminder of that terrible day, regardless of what you believe. It goes a lot deeper for people, and it plays on your emotions. And it actually, I think, maybe this isn't the appropriate word, but to tie this in with Eliphas Levi's transcendental magic, it's almost as if it plays on the imagination. And as he wrote, the more difficult or horrible the operation, the bringing down, the disintegration, if you will, of the Twin Towers as a massive, I called it an energy ritual to a degree, then the greater the power of the operator in influencing the imagination and being able to, whether it's perverse or otherwise, black or white, being able to influence and control the people that are participating knowingly or unknowingly in the ritual. You know, we've done shows on the Olympics, for example. It's such a wide audience, millions of people across the world, all tuning into a very bizarre and strange choreographed ritual would be the best word to use, where even when I looked at the Taylor Swift video, Look What You Made Me Do, that you had mentioned to me, that I saw some reviews from the London Telegraph and a couple of other newspapers. And even though Taylor Swift is a very popular international star, the questions were posed, what exactly is this? This is really bizarre. This is really weird. This is haunting. This is eerie. That seems to be the same theme that we see in a lot of entertainment, and oftentimes in not just entertainment, but any other public display of ritual, where the public's looking at it thinking, what is this? This is very bizarre. And people like you and I come along and we try to do a little bit more research, look at the symbols and try to determine what it means. Maybe we don't have all the answers, but it's much more than just a music video. It's much more than just a piece of steel from the World Trade Center.
Yeah, and there's something called necromantic tokens, and there are things that are venerated. In fact, the Catholic Church venerates like bones of past popes, or the bodies, or even finger bone, that sort of thing. And I look at that, I'm going, it's a part of the necromantic fascination and death ritualism and death fetishism that a lot of us don't even know is happening around us right now. I know that Donald Rumsfeld, after the Pentagon was hit, he actually had in his office, in his closet, actually, from what I understand, he had a tire from one of the planes, and he also had a piece of some of the metal from an American Airlines jet in his office, and they were mounted on wood, as if, like you'd take a deer trophy and mount it like that. And I'm thinking, maybe this is the way people deal with death, or perhaps not. Maybe this is some ghoulish necromantic token that he wanted to hang on to. And a lot of people don't realize that most of what is going on with regard to 9/11 is it is a necromantic death ritual. It's the idea that through the power of the 3,000 that have died, it's a control mechanism. And I was just reading the other day how, once again, we've had a new terminology. They said that 9/11 is actually a new terminology because no one refers to it as the attack on New York or the attack on the Pentagon. They refer to it as 9/11. Never in history has there been a digital word that means so much to so many people. And it's because of the fact that, once again, this is another thing. This is what I call dime store numerology, where what they have done is they have literally empowered two numbers, 9 and 11. And you, being a person who's studied the occult, know that those two numbers had a lot of significance for someone like Aleister Crowley, who was most certainly considered one of the most, diabolical magicians of his time.
Yeah, I found a couple of things interesting about what you just said. I've typically referred to it, including in my books, The Grand Illusion, The Persistent Illusion, I've referred to it as the events that took place in New York, in Washington, and in Shanksville. Because you're right, 9/11 has become this digital symbol that represents all of the suffering, all of the pain, and then also the patriotism. And something interesting I found in researching holidays, I like to look at the origins of holidays. Holiday comes from holy day, the days that are holy. And what has 9/11 become? 9/11 has literally become a holy day. It's called Patriots Day or Patriot Day. So 9/11 has actually been turned into a religious cult-like holy day. And those questioning the cult-like behavior or even addressing the behavior, looking at the symbolism, you're talking earlier about using a girder or some type of metal. There's a memorial, a ritual site here in Boise, Idaho, even for that. And it becomes this bizarre ritual. The people participating are doing so to themselves. It's unbeknownst. They don't really understand, know, or think that they're participating in anything more than honoring those who died or venerating those who died, remembering 9/11, remembering those who died. And it's no different than when you watch a music video by a Taylor Swift or a Lady Gaga. A lot of parents think that, well, it's just, catchy, popular music. It's pop music. It's kind of upbeat. It's catchy. My kids can listen to it. There's no problem with that. But when you look at it a little bit deeper, it's much more than just pop music. It's much more than just your favorite celebrity dancing and singing. And in fact, since you bring up Aleister Crowley, one thing I wanted to mention, I actually took a little note so I wouldn't forget. Aleister Crowley was a literary. He wrote books that were fictional, but he also wrote some things that weren't fictional. There's a story at Loch Ness in Scotland where he was supposedly trying to summon the Scarlet Woman. And there's a couple of connections I made here watching the Taylor Swift video, Look What You Made Me Do, is one, Aleister Crowley developed through the OTO a ritual called the Cake of Light ceremony or the Cake of Light sacrament. Now, Marina Abramovic, who was doing quote unquote rituals or artistic expressions with the Podestas, which came out during the presidential election, another high level participant in the political system. Marina Abramovic was doing the same type of ritual, and she was using blood, semen, and breast milk. Now, what's interesting about that is, with the exception of Crowley, who used honey, blood is the life force, semen is the seed of life, and breast milk is a nurturing substance. These are three key ingredients that are used in alchemy. So I went back to this old 16th century alchemical text by the physician Paracelsus, and he stated, this is a quote, "As by art, they," the golem, if you will, the golem acquires their life. By art, they acquire their body, flesh, bones, and blood, and are born by art. Now, if you look at what Marina Abramovic stated about these rituals, she said that these are not religious rituals. They are not legitimate practices in public. They're artistic expressions. But in private, they become expressions of art that have a deeper meaning. And then they started in some of the videos, you can see she's actually painting these little tiny statues with blood, semen, and breast milk. So to me, it almost seemed like a form of invocation on top of the veneration for death, which is something we also see through Death and Resurrection in Taylor Swift's video, where she is seated between two pillars, which is so common throughout all the Super Bowl symbolism. And
the goddess card in the tarot, the symbols, the high priestess, yes. Yeah.
And what is she wearing? She is wearing the red dress of the Scarlet Woman, Lilith.
Scarlet Woman. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's exactly right. And you're speaking of Abramovic. I remember when Podesta, there was a scandal about eating the spirit cookies or the light cookies and having these spirit cooking ceremonies. And what was included in these spirit cooking ceremonies was the idea of cake that was made, these life-size body cakes. They're a lot like the skull cakes that were eaten by Prince William at his bachelor party. And these skull cakes and the body cakes are a representation of what would be called a sacrilegious sacrament. The idea that eating the body or participating in a ritualistic, cannibalistic way in defiance, or at least in I guess you could call it the obverse of a sacred sacrament. This was something that is in a video that Katy Perry called Bon Appetit. It's her new song. Katy Perry does this, and it looks like right out of the pages of Abramovic. It looks right out of the pages of the spirit cooking ceremonies. And it's just, and it's difficult to see this because what I'm witnessing lately in the music industry is, once again, this, I guess you could call it occult engineering or causal engineering. What we're seeing is stars now, pop stars, who seem to be having personality disorders, or they're having these disassociative flare-ups where in their videos, they go from being what we call the perceived view of being a wholesome rock star singer to a person that's decided that they're going to give their way to the dark side, such as Taylor Swift in her new video, "Look What You Made Me Do." I mean, you look at all of the personalities that she claims she has, and you look at this narcissistic, godlike personality that she's taken on, where she's standing in front of the letter T, which of course is Taylor Swift, but I saw nothing more than the Tammuz, ancient Tammuz ritual, where the T square used to be the representation of the crucifix. So actually she's standing there as if she's, crucifying or being crucified by other personalities. And I see this a lot with people like Kanye West, who, had a meltdown on stage, and then they said he was mentally ill. He said, "Jay-Z, I hope you don't kill me for revealing the truth." And then he ends up, going into a hospital, coming out, his hair's blonde and shaved. Same thing happened with Katy Perry. She said during an interview, how are things holding up? The interviewer asked Katy Perry, and she says, "Well, at least I'm not shaving my head," referring to what happened to Britney Spears. And then 2-3 days later, she shaves her head.
Shaves her head, yeah.
With Miley Cyrus, the same thing happened to her.
Amanda Bynes also, and even, most people might know this more symbolically in Eminem, Slim Shady, that alternate personality and ego. Slim Shady is the blonde hair, and Eminem says in a song, I think it was "My Darling," he says, "All Slim Shady is a bottle of hair bleach and vodka," an alternate personality. And those connections are so profound to me when you look at Amanda Bynes, Britney Spears, Kanye West, Eminem, or Slim Shady. And you look at a handful of others who have, like a Miley Cyrus, who in her show on the Disney Channel, what does she play? She plays a young girl who lives two lives, Hannah Montana and Miley Cyrus. You've got the alternate personality there again. And what I found so profound about the Taylor Swift video is, as you said, she's there with the Tehu cross, and at the very end of that brief clip, she sticks her arms out on the cross as if she's crucified. And at that moment, all of the alternate personalities, all the different characters that are crawling up and crawling over top of each other for prominence, get kicked and thrown off of the cross. And so this form of Taylor Swift is the quote-unquote victorious one, but she is crucified, dead, and then resurrected again, which is how the video starts out. You have this resurrected zombie-like Taylor Swift coming out of the grave, and then there's a brief clip where the living Taylor Swift, is placed into the grave with her hands over her chest like this, which is what the Egyptian pharaohs used to do. It's a symbol of monotheistic dualism, the union of the male and female, the two pyramids, the Seal of Solomon. You have the inverted and the right up pyramid, and they put them together. I actually have it up here on my wall here above my hand there, if you can see it. It's the Seal of Solomon. That is the micro-macrocosm, dualism. It's a symbol that represents also zodiacal characteristics, because the pharaohs would hold the crook and the flail. The crook would herd the followers of the sheep, or Aries the ram, and the flail would herd the followers of the bull, or Taurus. And those two symbols, that creates the cross, that's the triangle going upward and downward and intersecting. So that symbolism is that symbol is a very, very profound symbol. And for her to be doing that as she goes into the grave brings out the same type of Egyptian-esque symbolism as when we had Kanye West in that music video Power, where he has this huge Horus amulet. He stands between the two pillars, just like Taylor Swift is as the Scarlet Woman in this new video that's out, the new music video. And he has these. This is very symbolic of what you were just mentioning a moment ago about the eating of the cakes and the skull cakes and the light cakes. These two assassins come in to kill Kanye West, who's the king. He's the king. Come in to kill Kanye West. Now that symbolism is extremely important. It goes back to Egypt and the ceremony or a ritual that pervades many, many different cultures called the killing of the king. And the king would symbolically be killed, and then the new harvest, the last harvest of the year, would be gathered. They would make bread. The bread would be a symbol of the body of the god, and then they would eat the bread in a consecrated ritual like the Eucharist, and then they would drink his blood. All of this ties together. All of this is very significant, and again, you're going to see this in the entertainment industry, and you're also going to see this in the highest levels of politics. And for these people to suggest that it's just art, it has no meaning, is not to suggest that it's irrelevant. It's to suggest that you shouldn't pay attention to this, because I personally believe there is real power in that, just even if it's only belief. Because remember, imagination is what gives these people the power, as Eliphas Levi, a famous magician, said.
Well, I mean, and that's the thing, is people would say we're bringing this up, we're saying it's bad. I'm not necessarily saying it's bad or good. What I'm saying is that whether or not you understand that it affects your cognitive liberty. That's the point. I mean, your ability to think, okay, is whatever you decide you want to, put into your mind, and whatever you want to believe, and whatever your cognitive biases are, and whatever your cognitive flexibility is, which of course is how far are you going to go before you realize you're being compromised. And I brought this up the other night. I said, especially when, the Pope had stated that he felt that people who don't believe in climate change are stupid and stubborn. And then what happened after that was that there was a number of people who came forward saying that we should jail people who don't believe in climate change, or prosecute them. People like Bill Nye the Science Guy believes that we should put them to death because it violates his freedom and his cognitive liberty. He says this violates mine. And then if you notice that when the hurricane relief began, it started right off with Stevie Wonder. Before he played, he says, if these hurricanes do not convince you that global warming is real, then you are blind and stupid. And then what's odd about that is none of these individuals who are on this hurricane relief read the NOAA report about how they said that none of these hurricanes that just happened were the result of global warming or climate change. They said, now, that does not mean that these hurricanes could not have been, intensified by global or climate change, but that remained to be seen. So in the meantime, they're using these very, very powerful storms as an argument that we call it Excelsior, where how can you prove me wrong that these storms were terrifyingly, powerful and more powerful than we've seen in a long time? Well, quite frankly, they're storms we haven't seen in a long time.
But we have seen them in the past.
Yes, we've seen them in the past, and we've seen powerful storms in the past as well. But it just seemed to me that everything was quieter at one time. And now, we're back to this. But what was odd, and I pointed this out, is the minute the Senate decided to vote for a $10 million increase for the climate summit and the Paris Accords, because Donald Trump said, "Oh, I'm not going to do this. We're not going to be a part of this anymore because it's not good for America." But then the Senate said, "Well, in the aftermath of Harvey and Irma, I think we should certainly, well, before even Irma hit ground, they were saying that this storm should convince you that we need the money for climate science." And so apparently we wrote out a check for $10 million to the UN. And when that happened, Hurricane Irma, when it hit Florida, was reduced to a Category 3, not a Category 5 or 4, but a Category 3. It missed the trajectory as they thought. And then Jose, which was waiting in the wings, took a U-turn. And I'm thinking, now, how did that happen? Did they either steer these storms using some sort of a weather control? Did they magically push these storms out of the way because the money was, the ransom or the extortion was fulfilled? And it's like, it just seems so odd that when we had a storm so devastating in the Gulf and Texas, that the other storm that was a Category 5 that pounded the hell out of the Caribbean came to Florida, and it was just like a typical hurricane for them. And of course, Jose, which they thought was going to pummel us again, took a U-turn. Now they're saying that Jose may go up like off the coast, the East Coast. So, how is it that we can't see that this may be either some sort of occult engineering or even weather or geoengineering? These are the things I think people need to pay attention to.
Right. Something else I noticed that I don't think was really talked about by any media. I don't watch TV, but I watch some things online occasionally. And I talked to some people who were watching the hurricane because I'm from Tampa. Tampa was supposed to get destroyed in this hurricane, and not much of anything happened. It was a regular hurricane, as you said, for most of them. And I was told that all the news coverage was focused strictly on the hurricane, how terrible it's going to be, how horrible it's going to be, everything's going to be flooded and destroyed. Well, in the midst of all of that, Clyde, last week there was a solar flare on Wednesday, so 8 days ago, a massive X-class solar flare, not the biggest ever. Then there was another one a few hours after that. Within 24 hours of those solar flares, Mexico felt one of the largest earthquakes, the largest in a century. And then they had a hurricane hit Mexico City. Katya, I believe, was the name. That was in the Gulf. Now, in the midst of that, there was also these incredibly large wildfires in the Pacific Northwest, which both of us have been subjected to. Also spoke here in Boise, Idaho. And of course, in Yellowstone, we have the largest, or one of the largest, series of tremors ever recorded, 2,300, and that is a number that's continuing to grow. But overall, what I noticed between the solar flares, the fires, the tremors at Yellowstone, the earthquake in Mexico, and these hurricanes was that every time I saw a news story, and I printed some of these out, I try to stay up to date on this and find patterns, they kept saying the largest hurricane, the most powerful hurricane, and when they did cover the earthquake, the largest earthquake, the most powerful solar flares, but none of that was really true. The most powerful hurricane in terms of sustained wind speed was back in the 1980s. The largest amount of tremors ever recorded at Yellowstone was back in the 1980s, and some of these in the early 80s. And what's interesting about that to me is back in the late 70s into the early 80s, and I was born after that, so correct me if I'm wrong, one of the common environmental concerns was global cooling, that the environment was actually cooling down. Yeah. I don't recall seeing anything that the global cooling was the reason we had those intense hurricanes. But I also think, as you said, it was almost a form of extortion. And I've made this suggestion before, when we'd see a mass shooting and Obama would get on stage with the kids and say, this is what's going to happen if we don't pass this gun legislation. To me, that's not a warning. To me, that's a threat. And it sounds the same when we see these hurricanes. Like, if you don't get on board with climate change and you don't start paying a carbon tax, these things are only going to intensify. And if you get on board, well, maybe they'll just dissipate and go off like Jose did. To me, it sounds like a form of extortion. It seems like a threat rather than a warning.
Well, and people always say to me, well, Clyde, if there's weather control, why don't you prove it? And I'm saying, well, okay, here's the deal. The biggest example of this is just what happened with Harvey and with Irma. And that is, okay, so they're doing this hurricane relief, and they're saying that if we don't, if we don't help with the climate science thing, we don't get behind carbon tax and get behind any of this, it's just going to get worse. Well, no, I mean, how is it that if we start paying these carbon taxes, and if we do decide we're going to use alternative energy sources and whatever, I'm fine with, alternative energy. I don't have a problem with that. What I have a problem with, though, is the promise. How is it that they can make such big promises about something as fractal? It's a huge fractal. You don't know how it's going to happen. The weather. I talked with Scott Stevens, and I said, I've studied meteorology before I even got into radio. And I said, from one weather study to a weatherman, I want you to admit on the air right now that weather prediction and climate is all a guessing game. And he says, well, yeah, that's right. He says, we as weathermen, we have all these computers, we have all these models that we can watch and report. But he says, in reality, a storm can completely fool us and do something totally different. But what's odd now is that they can now pinpoint trajectory. They now can tell us, if it's going to die off or it's almost like they're prognosticating what is happening. And then to tell us that if we pay our dues, that if we give into the climate idea, that some miraculous change that has taken 30 to 40 years or maybe even 100 years to happen is going to happen just like that, and they're going to be coming in to save the day, which kind of indicates to me that they do have control over these. They do know how to make them go away, and they also know how to force multiply them to prove a point. And you're right, it's extortion. And I don't know how people can't see this, because if my carbon tax is going to miraculously change the weather, I'd be very surprised.
Yeah, precisely. And in fact, I actually have some pretty blatant proof that weather control is real. I've got a document, and you can find this online, declassified, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA. And this is actually, I believe this was published by the United States Department of Commerce back in 2009. And on top of this document, we also had the famous world-renowned physicist Michio Kaku state on CBS that they're using trillion-watt lasers to blast the atmosphere and cause condensation, rain. And he even stated that they can cause flooding and alter hurricanes. Now, there's a big difference, of course, between creating a hurricane and modifying a hurricane. So even if someone in government was to say, we don't have the technology to create a hurricane, well, they might be telling the truth, but they do have the technology to modify one. So this document I have here is from 2009. It's from the U.S. Department of Commerce and the Office of Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. This was called the Hurricane Aerosol and Microphysics Program, HAMP. $64 million of taxpayer money. And here's this wild, almost like a mind game that's played. It's a form of magic, actually. It says, while the OAR recognizes that weather modification in general is occurring through the funding of private enterprises, NOAA, NOAA, does not support research that entails efforts to modify hurricanes. Now, immediately, my first reaction to this, when you read this document, is that they say it's occurring through funding private enterprises. So NOAA doesn't have to actually do it. They can contract out third parties to do it and still be in control of the research, first of all. Second of all, they acknowledge in the same document that even though they're not on board with efforts to modify hurricanes, and that's the word modify, not create, it says NOAA and its predecessor agency supported and conducted research into hurricane modification in the 60s with Project Storm Fury. And they go on, Clyde, to explain that it remains unclear if enough knowledge has been gained to make any new modification attempts practical, but if they used pollination aerosols and spray chemicals into the atmosphere, then it was found that, quote, aerosols substantially affect cloud microphysics and that they were able to alter, not create necessarily, but alter hurricanes and other forms of weather. It's in federal government documents. We're not even talking about all of the actual private enterprises that study this, like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation.
Well, Scott Stevens, when I talked with him the other night, he was kind of indicating the same thing. He said that he believes that it's not that we can make hurricanes. What we can do, however, is we can exploit hurricanes. We can exploit tornadoes. And he means exploiting them in the media, for one, and the other is exploiting them or force multiplying them using what Michio Kaku had said on the CBS report, saying that, yes, they are firing lasers. And what I found interesting about that CBS report is, and if you review it, if you can Google it or review it, you'll see that we have the commentators there, Charlie Rose, and I don't know who the woman is that's on there, but Charlie Rose is there, and this other woman is interviewing him. And this is from a 2013 interview. So many people are passing this along on the internet right now saying it's about Harvey and Irma, when it absolutely isn't. It's a 2013 interview.
That's right.
And what's interesting is that when he starts speaking of things like Operation Popeye, of course, where they turned the monsoon on in Vietnam during the Vietnam War. Yeah, it happened. But it's funny because you hear the reporters say, allegedly.
Oh, no, allegedly.
Allegedly happened. But it did happen. And then you hear Michio Kaku realize, oh, I see. So I have to say that all of this information is inconclusive, he says. Inconclusive. And then he goes on to say about, well, it's all been done in a lab. What is the lab? The lab is outside. The lab is the environment. The lab is the ecosystem. That is the lab. So it's been done in the lab, which is the ecosystem. It's been done in the troposphere. It's been done in the bathysphere. It's been done all over. But yet it's assumed, or it's alleged, according to what they're saying. He says inconclusive. And then, of course, the reporters are forcing Michio Kaku to say this is all alleged. It's not alleged. It's happened. It's happening. And it's one more part. I mean, geoengineering, occult engineering, whatever you want to call it, it's something where they're using whatever magic, and I mean that in a Arthur C. Clarke sort of way. I would say that, you know, yes, all of this technology is indistinguishable from magic, but it's the magic that certainly has purpose. It's done with intent, and it's done sometimes out of sheer will, as of course as Sally Quinn had said, that she released a statement today saying that with intent she created these curses or hexes, and she believes that the 3 people she cursed and hexed had passed away or died. And I'm thinking, how do you just openly say that, well, I participated in a death wish, these 3 people are dead? And I'm curious, well, you know, what do we do? Use spectral evidence to try and say that she was responsible for the deaths of these people? Or does it contribute? I mean, and I was even pointing out that when I was a kid, that's really funny. So when I was a kid, I really loved, my favorite Dr. Seuss book of all time was Bartholomew and the Oobleck. And I said that if you read that book, I don't think many people know about the book. If you read that book, King Durward, who was of the Kingdom of Dead, one day woke up and said, I hate the weather. He said, I just hate it. So he called all his magicians together and said, I want you to give me something better than rain or snow. Give me something better falling out of the sky that I can enjoy. And so what the magicians came up with was something called Oobleck, where they engineered or they created this magical cloud that came over. And what Oobleck was this viscous snot-like crap falling out of the sky. And people were getting stuck to each other, and it was piling up, and it turned into a major disaster where the king didn't plan on it. And so finally, he was about ready to drown in all this goop that he created. And finally, Bartholomew said, there's one thing that'll take care of this, and I know what it'll be. You just have to say, I'm wrong, I did this, I'm responsible, I'm sorry. And the king says, I'm not going to say I'm sorry. I don't feel responsible for this. I just wanted to change the world. And so it just kept on coming up to his mouth. Finally, he did say, I'm sorry, and it cleared up. Now, I don't think things like that are that simplistic, but I think what Dr. Seuss was trying to do, it was trying to say that, mankind can create a toxic blow to the environment. And when they do, we're all going to end up, either getting stuck in it or drowning in it or dying in it. And it just seems to be out of hand in that regard.
Yeah, and part of that magic is when we use words or phrases like man-made climate change. Do you believe in man-made climate change? Well, absolutely, because we have government programs where they're blasting sulfur into the atmosphere. Even in the journal Science a few weeks ago, they were talking about blasting sulfur into the atmosphere in order to deflect heat, which then they said, well, that'll actually increase the temperatures on the Earth and increase the warming of the globe. That was their solution to global warming, man-made global warming. So it's real. I think what's really important is perspective on these subjects, Clyde. I like the comedian Bill Hicks. Bill Hicks said, watch CNN headline news for an hour. It's the most depressing thing you'll ever see. War, famine, death, AIDS, homelessness, recession, depression. And then you look out your window and you're thinking, where's all this happening at? And I think that's really key because I'm from Florida, so I grew up with hurricanes back throughout the whole 21st century as I was growing up. So I know what it's like to be in a hurricane, some big ones, including the big one in 2005. And, you live on the coast, you live somewhere where there's the chance that there might be a natural disaster, like building your house on a fault line and there being an earthquake, your house being destroyed, and you blame that on climate change or you blame that on the environment. You build a house on the water levels rise, your house gets destroyed, you build the house again, so on and so forth. You continue to do this, and every time the water levels rise, you blame it on climate change. It's all about perspective, because while that hurricane was pounding those islands, the Bahamas, the Keys, Florida, Houston, Mexico, I'm up here in Boise, Idaho, and with the exception of some smoke, it's a pretty nice day outside. And pretty much anywhere else in the world you go, the whole rest of the planet, with the exception of a few places that might be torn apart by war, it's a pretty nice day outside. So if you focus all the media attention on the worst hurricane, the worst earthquake, the worst solar flares, the worst tremors, the worst fires, you're going to start to think, well, oh my goodness, this is the end of the world, which I just did a show on this on Wednesday, last night on The Secret Teachings. But if you were to focus on a beautiful flower blooming in a field and you just focused on that 24 hours a day, people would think that hurricanes don't even exist.
Well, and another form of this occult engineering can be taken right from the churches themselves, who I know right now. I mean, the apocalyptic scripture referencing, the idea that people think that on September 23rd, with the Virgo convergence, that the rapture is going to happen. And I'm thinking, who's pushing this now? Who's pushing the idea that the rapture is going to happen on the 23rd of September? Now, we know that something weird and interesting and coincidental is going to happen in the skies, and that's fine. But to read into it something more, I mean, we know that the stars affect us. We know that eclipses affect us, and they affect the environment. We know this. And we know that when the eclipses happen, people with ill intent do rituals. We know that, ceremonies are done because of the black sun and what the black sun represents to occultists. So we know that the occult is, actively, doing ritual in times of eclipses. But what kind of ritual has sparked this idea that because of some strange occurrence in the sky, whether it be, the birth of Jupiter, which of course is another thing, or the dragon eating Jupiter or whatever. I mean, why now do we say that this will be a lot of people believe it's going to be the rapture, when I don't believe it's going to be. It's going to be an interesting aside, and we'll have to see, how it affects the world afterwards. Because it affects people, and people do things. Then people eventually, if they get neurotic enough, create problems, and that's what we're seeing. And so, yeah, who's pushing this end of the world eschaton issue, which is another form of occult engineering? And I think the people that are pushing this issue, and I report about it, and I find it interesting. I like talking about it and doing the what ifs. But the truth be known, this is another form of occult engineering.
I would agree with you, Clyde, and I would add to that in terms of influence. We don't hear much about the sun when we talk about climate. We don't hear much about the sun when we talk about natural disasters on Earth. And I find that interesting, considering the fact that even the Department of Defense in the United States back in the 1990s said that in order to prevent eco-terrorism and natural disasters used as a form of terrorism, that they would need to put into action provisions to prevent terrorists from getting access to weapons that could influence and set off earthquakes and volcanoes. And they specifically said this can be done through electromagnetic waves. And what I found very interesting is last 2 weeks, we had these solar flares last Wednesday, a week ago, early September here. And we had these solar flares, 24 hours of this big earthquake in Mexico. There's very little talk about the solar flares, although they were acknowledged before the event in Mexico happened. Usually we don't hear about them until after. But what is a solar flare? Highly charged plasma. It interferes with communications. NASA said it shut down some of their communications to satellites, communications to various other outlets, and they had radio trouble. It's because of electromagnetic waves. So if you have electromagnetic waves used on Earth from mechanical technology that can induce or trigger an earthquake or a volcano, and that's been acknowledged for decades upon decades upon decades, theorized at the very least, why would it be strange to suggest that the sun can also trigger massive earthquakes and trigger volcanoes? And I think to acknowledge that, while simultaneously these scientists ignore that fact and say, well, the solar eclipse, the solar flare, they can make you feel woozy and give you a headache. But they never want to talk about the fact that the sun influences the climate on Earth, and why the sun is always demonized as this evil ball of energy. It'll give you cancer. If you go out in the sun too long and you stand there with no sunscreen on, you could get really sick. The EPA even said like 3 years ago, if you put a plant outside, sunlight's bad for plants. So they demonize the sun, and meanwhile, the sun is responsible for a lot of the things that you, me, and everyone listening, and everybody we know, we're blamed for. We're blamed for breathing. Carbon dioxide is listed as a pollutant by the U.S. Congress. It's really incredible. That's the form of magic where you're getting people to essentially turn against life. You're getting them to turn against themselves. It's a form of perverse, inverted will, where if you can't control somebody directly, you have them police themselves, censor themselves, and turn on themselves so they eat themselves.
Well, and that's a very good point. They eat themselves. It's like I find an awkward conversation in when I bring up, like you said, you just did a show about the end of the world and end times and all this, and I'm probably going to do that tonight because I have one of the guests I'm having on for an hour is the producer of a movie called Sign, or The Sign, which is about some religious ties to the eclipse and to these further things. And I would fully agree with you that, the sun is demonized. And I think also, though, I don't think they're telling us the truth about the sun and what's going on with it. I mean, they tell us in billions of years the sun will go dark and we'll all die. But, we're seeing the sun acting up, doing crazy things. And the eclipse, I mean, one of the things that's hilarious is I did a whole show about how an eclipse is a harbinger of doom, or an eclipse is a powerful occult tool. And I said, we better be aware of the fact that throughout history, an eclipse has represented the falling of governments, the falling of kings, and maybe even natural disasters. No sooner had I said that, the eclipse happened. It was a great experience for me. I saw it happen in Lebanon, Oregon. No sooner did I say about this, or talk about this, we had 27, so far we've had 27 known disasters all over the world since the eclipse. And I said, isn't it odd, that somehow the ancient superstition has reared its ugly head, and here we are now talking about these 27 disasters. Now, I deal in coincidence. I deal in synchronicity. I deal in cause and effect, sometimes even reverse causality and effect. And when you talk about these subjects, people are dumbfounded by them because they think that everything is linear. They think everything is going in a straight line when simultaneously things are happening all along. This is a very big world. It's a very big world, and there's a very big universe, and things happen simultaneously. And sometimes you can't cover it all. You can't necessarily fit it all into one apocalyptic box. And I think people are trying to do that to try and explain the fears they have of a future that they think is completely out of the question. There will be no future. And I find it also a part of occult engineering when you find Christians who actually say this is going to be the best thing that's ever going to happen to them, that the apocalypse is coming and that people are going to die around them because they've been evil. And I'm thinking, you're saying this because you don't think you're going to get hurt. You're saying this because you think you're going to be protected. And say that to the people in Mexico that died in the earthquake. Say that to the people that thought they could fight off the hurricanes and not run and evacuate when they were told to. They thought it wouldn't hurt them either. And that's the thing, is that if you're willing an apocalypse spiritually, in the material, we will find our apocalypse, and eventually we'll find our end of the world, in my opinion.
Yeah, I actually heard the comedian Bill Maher say that it's an inconvenient truth that people who have houses in the way of Hurricane Irma deserve to have their houses destroyed only if they don't believe in climate change, which I thought was very counterproductive to the point he was trying to make, because what about your neighbor who does believe in climate change? Do they deserve to have their house destroyed too? It's the same cult-like, I don't want to say religious, but religious-esque mentality where people just fall victim, unfortunately, to the cult-like mentality of having this high priest figure following the rules and the doctrines, being cast into hell or being allowed into heaven if you agree or disagree with the tenets of that belief system. I think it's not just religion in the traditional sense. I mean, climatology. You and I, when we were at ECETI recently, we watched one of your old Ground Zero lounges where you were talking about how climatology or climate change has become this religious cult. I'm not sure exactly what you called it, but it has become.
Mormon church, I called it.
Yeah, that's right. Because we looked at the Pope the other day. You mentioned this at the beginning of the broadcast, and Jorge Bergoglio said humanity is going down if we don't address this.
3 years he gave us. He gave us 3 years, by the way.
Again, a threat more than a warning.
3 years we will not be here if we don't abide by the rules of the Paris Accords and about climate change. So once again, extortion process, occult engineering going on all around us, and people don't realize that they're falling for it. It's like, why are you falling for this beguilement? This is extortion. This is threatening, and this is something that, in my opinion, we should not have to be bullied into taking care of this planet. And I tell people, look, just because I say I don't believe in the political ramifications of climate change, and I don't want to support this type of bullying and this type of rhetoric, that does not mean that I don't believe that the planet should be saved. I don't believe that we should be taking care of the ecosystem and not crapping in the place we live. I mean, those are basic things, and it's not political. Those are things that should be in your soul anyway. You should be able to see a sunset. You should be able to go to a mountain area and camp without having to worry about fires. You should have to worry about how, putting antibiotics and other crap in the water is making men infertile and causing fish to go crazy. You should be aware of this. But no, we focus on one aspect, that's fossil fuels. We focus on that. And then for some reason, the money that they want to have us give is extortion. And basically the guarantee we're supposed to get is better weather. I call BS on that, because unless they have the control of the weather, then they can safely say to do this. And so actually they're coming right out and saying inconclusively, Michio Kaku, that they really do
allegedly
have control of the weather.
Yeah, the World Bank wants $4 trillion with a T. $4 trillion, they say, and we'll be able to basically save the planet. We keep seeing that statement come up. Bill Nye even starts his Netflix show with Bill Nye, the science guy, and I'm here to save the world or save the planet. You keep hearing that. It's like this self-righteous pseudo-intellectualism where people think that, like George Carlin said, save the planet. Are these people kidding me? We can't even take care of ourselves, let alone save the planet. The planet's fine. And I think that really is such a unique and interesting lack of perspective that people don't have is that the planet is going to be here regardless if we are or not. It's been here for billions of years. If an asteroid the size of California strikes somewhere on the planet today and it wipes out our civilization as we know it, the planet is going to be here. Humans will be gone. So we start to look at the world through that type of lens, and we recognize that when the World Bank says they want $4 trillion to halt climate change, you start to get involved with the IMF and the Bank for International Settlements and a whole bunch of central banks, and what it starts to look like is a global con job on the level of how these banks will go into a very small third world country, offer them a bunch of money. When they can't pay it back, they'll take the infrastructure, they take the land, they'll take the business, and if the leader doesn't want to abide by these new standards and they don't want to participate in the raping of their land and the exploitation of their people, they'll just execute them, or they'll paint them as a dictator, and we'll have the United States military go in and take them out. But this is being done now on a global scale, and it's being run through the Vatican as the example that we gave.
Yeah.
And this is a monumental scam on a global level. And when you start to look at the people that claim they're going to save us are international bankers. International bankers are going to save us, Clyde. That to me makes the least amount of sense of all of the arguments for how we can protect the planet.
And the sad thing is, if you point this out, as a matter of fact, I talked about the Pope's statements about people being stubborn and stupid if they don't believe in climate change. I actually had a number of trolls come to my Facebook page and said that I actually slandered the Pope 30 times in my show. And that I can only recall one thing that I said that may have been offensive about the Pope. Basically, I said that, you know, at this rate, his only miracle will be able to turn wine into urine. I said something to that effect, and everybody thought it was offensive. And it was supposed to be offensive. That's why I said it. But to say that, you know, me being critical of a Pope who's supposed to, in my opinion, look after the affairs of his church, like pedophilia and Satanism and human trafficking, which of course is plaguing the church. He doesn't address those issues, but he feels that it's necessary for him to address issues of our government, communism, Marxism, the idea that President Trump is making bad decisions, that he's evil, and of course, climate change and immigration. I stop and I say to myself, this guy is not a pope. He's a state representative that speaks on behalf of his own ideas of what government should be and not the affairs of his church. And when I see that, and I see also entertainers who, rather than entertain us, decide that they take that opportunity to scold us on what we're not doing and telling us that if we don't believe in something that they believe in, we're stupid. Science has never, most sciences, if you questioned the thought processes, you don't have somebody say to you, you're stupid, nor you have scientists or people like Bill Nye, the science janitor, saying this too. And I just shake my head and say, look, you know, if you can't see this bullying, if you can't see the destructive group dynamic playing on your cognitive liberty and you're using your cognitive flexibility to excuse it, then you most certainly are going to be caught in the trap of cultism, which is exactly what people are falling for, is this American cult or the Americult attitude that either that you're basically destroying loyalty, or you're disloyal to your party, you're disloyal to your agendas that people have told you to follow, and you're feeling that someone else is stepping all over them when they show you. Do you understand what you're doing here? Do you understand what this is going to lead to? Do you understand that you're going to be drinking the Kool-Aid, or do you understand that you're going to be taking the applesauce and phenobarbital and laying in the bed and not waking up? These are the things that are happening right now with this whole cult-like attitude towards, well, everything that we're being subjected to with this occult engineering. It's amazing that people aren't picking up on it.
It's like a standard form of stage magic. Watch this hand and don't watch this hand. And that's what it seems like when we hear these people talk, such as Jorge Bergoglio. I read a story the other day, Clyde, about the humanity's going down. Humanity's stupid if we don't get on board with the World Bank and carbon taxes and Al Gore and all of those things. And in the article, they went through all of these different things that the Vatican wants. They want austerity. They want poor people to have more money. Meanwhile, the Vatican is one of the wealthiest institutions in the world. I don't support Trump, but Pope says that you can't build a wall. That's not right. That's not what Jesus would have done, or something like that. Meanwhile, there's a 200-foot wall that Vatican City rests behind. They said that people that don't believe in climate change want to use the planet to pollute and want to use the planet as their own playground. Meanwhile, the Pope, with the exception, or the Vatican, with the exception of the Queen of England, owns the most private land of anybody else or any institution on the planet. They even have the largest stockpile of gold on the planet when they lecture other people about giving money to the poor. All of these things are inversion. Look over here, don't look over here. Look over here, don't look over here. And unfortunately, science has become diversionary too. It's become filled with fallacies and, again, pseudo-intellectualism, where if you're an accredited scientist, you've got that white lab coat on, Clyde, you can say anything you want. You can back it up by no facts, and your opinion becomes a fact. But if you're somebody like yourself, somebody like me, you've done research, you're looking at things critically, we don't have a bias politically or religiously that halts our intellectual progression, then our facts and our observations by that status quo become mere opinions, and they're discredited because we don't have that white lab coat on, because we're not Bill Nye the paid off guy, and what we say doesn't matter, and what they say becomes the word of God written in red, and you must believe it or you're cast into the confines of hell. If you don't believe in climate change, you must want to pollute the planet. No, I don't.
Well, the new newspeak, climate change was the first newspeak, because they used to call it global warming, and then they called it climate disruption, and they call it climate change. Which, if you say you don't believe in climate change, you're a moron, because climate does change. It's always changing. But what they need to say is man-made climate change, or at least the political climate change. I was just reading the other day that they no longer say, if you don't believe in climate science, you're a moron. They now say people who don't believe in climate change are anti-science. And they no longer call it climate science. They call it science in general, saying that there are people out there that do not believe in science, and so they basically equivocate those who believe in the flat Earth with people who believe there's no climate change.
Okay.
Or the Holocaust, saying the Holocaust never happened, and actually putting them in that same category. So, I mean,
they go back. It's two extremes. You either believe it or you don't believe it. And to make a statement like, yes, climate change is real, and the one side says, see, we have a believer here. But I'll say, it's real, the climate does change, but I don't think it's necessarily because we're breathing too much. And then all of a sudden, I'm not a believer anymore, I'm a denier, I'm anti-science, I'm anti-progress. But I think what's more anti-science, Clyde, is to suggest that because a scientist said something, that they don't have to provide any proof, or they have to provide skewed proof, and then that just becomes reality because a scientist said it. If you have a look at what science does today, science takes information. Oftentimes through academia and through corporations, scientists are paid to come to conclusions. They'll do 10,000 studies and find one that represents the evidence they want. And unfortunately, science has been branded as something that it's not. Scientists are the issue. The corporatocracy is the issue, where you take evidence and you use evidence to prove your preconceived conclusion, as opposed to looking at the evidence and then altering your theory to match the evidence. And so what I really want to know is, when I'm told 97% of people agree, or 97% of scientists agree, that's the consensus reality, that climate change is real, I have two questions there. One, philosophically, let's have the discussion. What does climate change mean to you? And two, what about those other 3% of scientists? I want to know what they have to say. What evidence do they have? What research have they done? We never hear about the other 3%, because when those people start talking, they're immediately labeled with the ad hominem, you're anti-science, you're not a real scientist, you're anti-progress, you hate the planet. No, hold on a second. These people disagree. There's 3% of them apparently. They have something to say. I want to hear it. We know what the other 97% say. I want to hear what these 3% say. Like when you have a commercial, 9 out of 10 dentists recommend this mouthwash. Okay, well, I want to talk to the one dentist who doesn't recommend it. I want to know what that person has to say. I want a little more perspective on it, not just believing something because there's a consensus made.
Well, and of course, the Monsanto scandal that recently took place, where Monsanto actually wrote out their own science saying that glyphosate does not cause cancer, and some scientists just signed off on it.
Yep.
And you write your scientific study, we'll sign off on it, and
ghostwriters.
So, I mean, these things happen all the time, but you can't tell people this because they're already been told the great lie. They're already stuck in this mindset. But it's funny, a lot of people I run into don't believe in government's version of climate change. They just don't. They just think it's some sort of a cash cult, and it seems to be a cash cult. And I think people who understand the weather, understand the ecosystem, and understand what's going on, they know that something is up, and they're having their cognitive liberty played on. Ryan Gable, we're out of time. Once again, the book is The Technological Elixir. In fact, Secret Teachings is the radio show you do. Where can we find out more about what you do?
You can go to my website. It's very simple, www.thesecretteachings.info. It's .info. You can find all of my books there, The Technological Elixir. I have a book called Food Philosophy, The Grand Illusion, The Persistent Illusion, and I'm working on a bunch of other stuff. It's all on my website about my radio broadcast, the history of the show, 6+ years on air. I've interviewed hundreds of great people, including people like you, Clyde. And again, that's thesecretteachings.info. My show's very similar to Ground Zero, and I just do my own thing as you do your own thing, and we uncover as much of the occultism as we can and apply that to our research.
Thank you, Ryan, for being on the program.
Thank you, Clyde. You have a good night.
You too.